We're joined by Eugene Chausovsky. Welcome for joining us. Thank you very much. He's a geopolitical analyst. We appreciate you showing up tonight and being on our program. Eugene, let's start with what happened over the weekend. Mariupol has been under siege for so long, and observers saying the city is now in ruin. What's the status?
So the status is that there still is some Ukrainian resistance that continues to hold out in Mariupol, but the Ukrainians are being increasingly surrounded by the Russian forces. So it looks like that land bridge that Russia is trying to achieve in between Donbass in the east to Crimea, Mariupol is that last kind of holdout territory. So that could fall sometime in the coming weeks, but the Ukrainians have actually put up quite a significant resistance to at least prolong that inevitability.
And for obvious reasons, once they get a land-based bridge, if you will, then certainly things could take a stunning turn quickly.
Right, exactly. That's the focus for the Russian forces at this time. We've seen now Russia, start its new offensive in eastern Ukraine and shift its forces from other parts of the country, including the north and around Kiev. Although we've seen, as your report highlighted earlier, strikes against far-reaching cities like Lviv and in the north as well. But the ground forces will now be concentrated on this eastern part of Ukraine.
Eugene, it seems each week more and more punishing economic sanctions are aimed at Moscow as the world is aghast at the attack on Ukraine. And Putin is, of course, trying to deflect economic damage, saying Russia's economy is, quote, stabilizing. Do you think that's anywhere near being true?
Well, it's not really stabilizing, to any significant extent, although the ruble has somewhat stabilized for now, but that could be temporary in nature. And I think, the sanctions, depending on which ones that you're talking about, because there's so many different ones that have been applied, but some of them are very painful upfront, and others take more time to really have their effects felt. So whether you're talking about, technology controls, I think that's going to start, hitting the Russian economy and really their ability to wage the war as well further down the line. Now, I don't think sanctions, I think it's been quite clear that they're not going to stop Putin from taking the military action, but their intention is at least to make that as much painful as possible, and then eventually to have some kind of broader effect on Russian decision-making.
Yeah, and in part that broader effect could be the plight of everyday Russians. Clearly, the U.S. and its allies are hoping things will get so bad in Russia that people will demand an end to the fighting. And I think you made a great point by saying that some sanctions are hitting Moscow now, and some are going to take time. How are everyday Russians being affected, and do you ever see them not necessarily rising up, but vocalizing their concerns?
Sure. So, I mean, clearly the most, visible effect has been on rising prices. I mean, not just in Russia, but around the world, but especially in Russia, inflation has been, in the double digits and just soaring ever since the conflict began. But we're also starting to see some reports of job losses. I think it was the Moscow mayor that said quite recently that they could expect to see hundreds of thousands of jobs just in Moscow alone being lost. A lot of that is because, foreign companies and especially Western companies are pulling out. Now, whether that actually translates into greater pressure on Putin from the people, I think we've seen some level of resistance and some level of protest, especially early on. But I don't think that's going to be enough to translate into some major governmental change. If anything, that just has forced the government to clamp down even harder, both within Ukraine and within Russia itself.
Explain how this crisis is already reshaping the global economy. Do you think it could spark a global recession?
That depends on how long the conflict lasts and also to what extent we're going to see sanctions continue and potentially increase. So globally, we've seen, inflation being a key issue, as I mentioned, not just in Russia, but around the world, here in the U.S., elsewhere, with rising commodity prices, with rising energy prices. Agriculture, both Russia and Ukraine are major agricultural producers, so we've seen, food prices rise as well. So that's really the key issue here, is that whether the recession comes, I think that will depend.
And upcoming meetings between the IMF and World Bank are also being shaped by the economic fallout from the fighting. And we are seeing dramatic economic slowdown from just 2 months of warfare.
Right, exactly. And I think the energy sector will be especially key to watch because if we start to see whether the Europeans clamp down on energy imports from Russia, or for some reason, if Russia were itself to cut those off, that could have tremendous impact on countries like Germany, which are highly dependent on Russian energy, which could cause a recession, not just in Germany, but throughout Europe and all of the world. So I think that's part of the hesitation for countries like Germany and the EU as a whole to go after the energy sector really decisively. But then again, that will depend on how the war plays out and how long it prolongs itself.